They told you the 2008 crisis ended, that the bailouts worked, that the system was saved. But they didn't tell you what it cost. Not to them, to you. While the headlines moved on, the consequences calcified. Interest rates were slashed, money was printed, and Wall Street was rescued. But Main Street was left with stagnant wages, unaffordable homes, and a debt-fueled illusion of recovery. The crisis didn't end. It metastasized. It became the air you breathe, the rent you can't afford, the job that doesn't pay enough. The economy was never fixed. It was sedated. What rose from the ashes wasn't stability. It was a larger and more fragile bubble. And now, as debt ceilings crack and asset prices spiral, the truth becomes harder to ignore. This is not a post-crisis world. This is the crisis, extended, disguised, and far from over. In 2008, the world watched in horror as the global financial system teetered on the edge of collapse. Trillions vanished. Banks imploded. Panic spread. But instead of letting the system reset, governments stepped in, not to save the people, but to save the very institutions that caused the crisis. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero. It flooded the system with liquidity. Congress signed off on billion-dollar bailout. The message was clear. Risk was no longer punished. It was subsidized. Wall Street didn't just survive. It thrived. Bonuses returned. Stock markets soared. Asset prices inflated. And all of it was built on the backs of public debt and suppressed reality. While the elite leveraged free money, the average American faced a different kind of economy, one of wage stagnation, job insecurity, and exploding costs of living. Home ownership, once a cornerstone of the American dream, slipped further out of reach. College debt ballooned. Healthcare became a gamble. The rich got richer because the system was engineered that way. Financialization replaced productivity. Speculation replaced savings. Real wealth was replaced with inflated paper gains. And the worst part, they sold it to you as a recovery. They showed you the Dow Jones, not your grocery bill. They pointed to GDP while ignoring the millions juggling 3 jobs to survive. The crisis never ended because it was never truly resolved. It was papered over, prolonged, hidden behind quantitative easing and manipulated markets. Now, as interest rates rise and debt becomes harder to roll over, the fragility returns to the surface. The same system that cracked in 2008 is still with us, only bigger, more indebted, and far more dangerous. You weren't bailed out. You were sold out, and the bill is finally coming due. The story of the 28 financial crisis is often told as a closed chapter. A moment of panic, swiftly handled, responsibly resolved. But that narrative is a lie. What happened in 2008 wasn't a one-time collapse. It was the beginning of a permanent shift, a systemic transformation that embedded crisis into the foundation of the modern economy. We didn't fix anything. We froze it in place and pumped it full of morphine. The collapse began with housing, but it didn't end there. Subprime mortgages were just the spark. The real fire came from decades of deregulation, financial engineering, and unchecked greed. Investment banks repackaged toxic loans into AA-rated assets. Rating agencies played along. Politicians looked the other way. It was a house of cards, and when it fell, the people buried beneath weren't the ones who built it. When the smoke cleared, the solution wasn't justice. It was preservation. The biggest banks were declared too big to fail. They were rescued with taxpayer money and emergency liquidity. Lehman Brothers was sacrificed as an example. A warning. But the rest were saved and rewarded. The Federal Reserve launched unprecedented programs. Quantitative easing, zero interest rates, bond buying spree. They weren't temporary measures. They became the new normal. And what did that new normal look like? An economy addicted to cheap money. Markets that no longer reflect fundamentals, but depend on central bank signals. Corporations that borrow not to invest, but to buy back their own stock. Home prices detached from wages. A generation locked out of ownership, buried in student debt, and renting from Wall Street landlords. Behind the curtain of recovery was a quiet transfer of power. Central banks became the most important institutions in the world. Governments ceded responsibility. Elected officials no longer shaped the economy. Monetary technocrats did. They pulled levers in secret rooms, pushing liquidity into financial markets while telling the public inflation was transitory and wages would catch up. But they never did. Because the system wasn't designed for you. The bailout era birthed a new elite, not entrepreneurs or builders, but asset holders. If you owned stocks, bonds, or real estate, you became richer than ever. If you didn't, you fell further behind. This wasn't recovery. It was divergence. A split economy where prosperity lives in spreadsheets and struggle lives in the streets. And yet, the media called it growth. They pointed to the S&P 500, not to the 40 million Americans on food assistance. They celebrated job numbers without mentioning that most of those jobs offered no benefits, no security, and no path forward. The crisis was absorbed by the working class and forgotten by the ruling class. But history doesn't forget so easily. And when you zoom out, 2008 starts to resemble something else, Japan's lost decade. In the 1990s, Japan's asset bubble burst. The government responded with low interest rates and massive stimulus. But growth never returned. Their economy flatlined. Zombie companies survived on cheap loans. The central bank kept injecting liquidity, hoping something would spark. It didn't. And 30 years later, Japan is still paying for it. Sound familiar? The US chose the same path. Financialization replaced innovation. Liquidity replaced value. The Federal Reserve became a market maker, a crisis firefighter, and, increasingly, a permanent participant. And now, as inflation roars back and rates rise, we find ourselves in a new trap. The liquidated once saved us, now suffocates us. Because here's the truth no one wants to say, we can't go back. The tools that worked in 28 no longer function. Every rate hike cracks the system. Every debt ceiling debate pushes us closer to default. Every bank wobble reveals just how thin the ice really is. We're living in the long shadow of 2008, and the only reason the collapse hasn't repeated is because we've delayed it, not diffused it. This is what happens at the end stage of empires. When production gives way to speculation. When finance becomes the main export. When elites stop building and start extracting. America has become a casino with a central bank. And the house always wins until it doesn't. If you feel like you're falling behind, you are. If you feel like it's harder to get ahead, it is. That's not a personal failure. That's policy. That's consequence. That's what happens when a nation chooses to bail out assets instead of people, to save the stock market and sacrifice the labor market. The 2008 crisis never ended because the decisions made in its wake were never about ending. They were about preserving power, protecting wealth, avoiding reckoning. And now we are trapped in a cycle. Crisis, bailout, asset bubble, repeat. Each time the stakes grow. Each time the inequality deepens. Each time the escape route narrows. You don't see breadlines anymore. You see GoFundMe pages. You don't see bankruptcies. You see silent desperation. Rent takes half your paycheck. Debt takes the rest. Retirement is a fantasy. Stability is a myth. And every month you survive feels like an achievement. That is the legacy of 28. That is what we chose. So when they tell you the crisis ended, remember what really happened. Wall Street was saved. The public was sedated. The markets soared. Your life didn't. And now, as the next storm brews, the same people who caused it are still in charge. Still rich. Still insulated. Still printing answers to problems they create. This isn't a post-crisis world. This is a world rebuilt on crisis. A world designed to appear strong but rot from the inside. A world where collapse is no longer a moment, it's a system. And you're still paying for it. Every single day. The illusion of recovery after 2008 was built not on healing, but on hiding. Policymakers didn't fix the foundation. They decorated the facade. The cracks were still there, growing wider beneath the surface, but coated in enough liquidity and optimism to fool the masses. Wall Street roared back to life because it was wired to the money printer. Asset prices surged, but not because of innovation or productivity. They rose because the system demanded it. The market became a patient on life support, unable to breathe on its own, dependent on constant injections from the Fed. Meanwhile, real people were drowning. The average American worker, already bruised from outsourcing, automation, and wage suppression, was handed a new deal. Survive in a system that isn't designed for you. Jobs came back, but they were gig-based, benefit-free, and unstable. The cost of living rose faster than incomes. Rents spiked, healthcare became unaffordable, and education debt spiraled out of control. The dream of upward mobility, once central to the American identity, turned into a cruel joke. Millennials and Gen Z entered adulthood not with hope, but with debt. And now, many don't believe they'll ever own a home, retire, or escape the paycheck-to-paycheck grind. This wasn't accidental. It was the design of a system that chose asset holders over wage earners, markets over people. Financialization became the beating heart of the economy. Instead of building, we speculated. Instead of producing, we borrowed. Entire industries were hollowed out in favor of buybacks, mergers, and short-term gains. Corporations stopped being engines of value and became vessels for shareholder enrichment. CEOs were paid in stock, not cash, because stock was the only thing that mattered. And the Fed ensured it always went up. But what goes up, when untethered from reality, eventually falls. And as inflation began creeping back into the headlines in 2021 and 2022, the masks slipped. For over a decade, we were told inflation was dead, that we could print without consequence, that deficits didn't matter. But now, with prices rising and the cost of debt increasing, the empire's great illusion is breaking down. Interest payments on national debt are exploding. The Treasury plays chicken with the debt ceiling every year. Banks are showing signs of stress. And the Fed is trapped. Raise rates and trigger a crash, or lower them and reignite inflation. It's a no-win scenario because the real damage was done long ago. Every emergency measure became permanent. Every bailout set a precedent. And now we live in an economy where moral hazard is policy, where the wealthy are shielded from failure and the poor are left to absorb every shock. This is not capitalism. It's corporatized feudalism, a rigged system of privatized gains and socialized losses. And every time it collapses, the solution is the same, more of what caused the problem. They call 2008 the Great Financial Crisis. But in truth, it was the Great Financial Shift, a reordering of priorities, a public surrender to private power. And that shift has never been reversed. In fact, it's accelerated. Wall Street doesn't fear collapse anymore. It expects rescue. Congress doesn't regulate anymore. It negotiates with lobbyists. And the public doesn't believe anymore. It copes, distracted, exhausted, disillusioned. This is how decline looks in the modern age. Not through ruins, but through routine. Through slow suffocation, not sudden shock. The crisis is no longer a singular event. It's a climate, a permanent atmosphere of uncertainty and fragility. And unless that system is broken, truly broken, the outcome is inevitable. Stagnation for most, enrichment for few, and a society living on the edge of another engineered disaster. The question isn't whether the 2008 crisis ended. It's whether it ever could have ended under the choices we made. When we decided to inflate assets instead of restructure debt. When we chose to preserve institutions instead of reform them. When we prioritized appearances over substance. That's when the door closed. And now, 15 years later, we're still trapped inside, waiting for a recovery that never truly began. If you're wondering why your rent keeps rising, why your wages feel frozen, or why everything seems more expensive while your paycheck stays the same, look no further than the aftermath of 2008. The crisis was never truly a crash followed by recovery. It was a controlled demolition followed by a quiet restructuring, not of the economy, but of who the economy serves. And it no longer serves you. It serves capital. It serves those who own, not those who work. The real cost of rescuing the financial system wasn't the trillions in bailouts or stimulus. It was the slow erosion of fairness, mobility, and hope. A cost you've been paying every year since, whether you realize it or not. Rents exploded because investment firms bought up housing en masse, fueled by cheap money from the Fed. What used to be homes became assets. Neighborhoods became portfolios. Families now compete with hedge funds for a place to live. And they lose. Wage growth never kept up because labor lost leverage. Union power declined, job security vanished, and globalization ensured that someone, somewhere, was always willing to work for less. So your productivity rose, but your share of the profit didn't. That extra value went elsewhere, into dividends, buybacks, and executive bonuses. The wealth didn't disappear, it was extracted. And then there's the psychological toll, a generation raised on instability. The young don't dream of wealth. They dream of survival, of affording health care, making rent, of maybe one day being free of debt. The social contract has been rewritten in fine print. You work, you struggle, you obey, and in return you get nothing guaranteed. No pension, no affordable housing, no cushion. Just endless volatility packaged as opportunity. Meanwhile, the same system that caused the 2008 crisis continues to grow more concentrated, more financialized, more detached from reality. When COVID hit, the Fed once again flooded the markets with trillions, and again, the wealth flowed upward. Billionaires multiplied while small businesses vanished. The pattern was clear: crisis, response, inequality. Over and over again. The truth is, we never learned the lesson. Or rather, the people in power never had to. Because they didn't suffer. You did. You paid for the bailouts with a decade of stagnation. You paid for the asset bubbles with unaffordable rent. You paid for the illusion of recovery with a reality that keeps pushing you further down. This is the real legacy of 2008, not just a broken economy, but a broken narrative. One where they still tell you things are getting better, while your lived experience screams otherwise. And now, with interest rates rising and the debt ceiling weaponized in political games, we're right back on the edge. But this time, the margin for error is thinner. The tools are weaker. The trust is gone. And the system is far more fragile. You can feel it. Everyone can. The crisis never ended. It just changed shape, and it never stopped charging you for its survival. There's a reason it feels like you're working harder, but getting nowhere. Like the rules have shifted, but no one told you. That's because they have, and they did it in plain sight. The aftermath of 2008 wasn't just a financial recalibration. It was a quiet class realignment. The elites were protected. The institutions were propped up. The markets were revived. But the average person was handed a new economic reality. More fragile, more unequal, more rigged. And year after year, you've been told that things are improving. GDP is up. Unemployment is down. The stock market hits new highs. But none of that ever reflected your reality. Because the numbers were never about you. They were about them. Look at where we are now. Asset bubbles are everywhere. Real estate stocks, even collectibles, have become playgrounds for speculation. Prices rise not because of value, but because of excess liquidity chasing anything that resembles return. And when it pops, because it always does, the same cycle repeats. The public absorbs the fallout while the wealthy are shielded. It's a system that rewards financial recklessness and punishes discipline. If you saved money, inflation eroded it. If you avoided debt, you were priced out. If you played by the old rules, you lost. Because the new rules were written in the boardrooms of banks, not the halls of Congress. The Federal Reserve, once a behind-the-scenes stabilizer, became the central actor. Every word from its chair moves trillions. Every policy tweak decides whether your rent will jump or your job will vanish. But the Fed doesn't work for you. It works to preserve the system, and the system is designed to preserve wealth, not spread it. This isn't a conspiracy. It's worse. It's policy, out in the open, rationalized, normalized, and endlessly repeated. So if you're still waiting for the recovery, stop. This is it. This is what they built. And you were never meant to thrive in it, only to survive quietly. They told you the system was too complex to understand, too big to change, too vital to question. But here's the truth. It was never about complexity. It was about control. After 2008, a new kind of economy emerged, one where the illusion of stability was manufactured through manipulation, and where your struggles were the cost of someone else's safety net. You didn't fail. You were failed. Every rent hike, every stagnant paycheck, every delayed dream, all of it traces back to decisions made in rooms you were never allowed to enter. The system didn't break by accident. It was restructured by design. And now, as the cracks grow wider and the next downturn looms, they'll once again try to convince you that this is normal. That debt ceilings are just politics. That inflation is just temporary. That housing unaffordability is just economics. But deep down, you know better. You feel that every time you check your bank account, every time you calculate how much of your life is spent just trying to stay afloat, every time you watch the wealthy get bailed out while you're told to tighten your belt. This isn't a cycle. It's a trap. One that began in 2008 and has never been dismantled. And unless it's confronted, unless the truth is spoken plainly, it will continue. The next crisis won't come out of nowhere. It's already here. You're living in it. The bailout never ended. The price is still being paid. And the longer we pretend otherwise, the more permanent this silent collapse becomes.